Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist. This is almost kind of part 2 of a very, very well-received episode that I did a few weeks back with the great Bob Burnham. Bob was talking to me about the after-action reports that he had found along with Moises, his colleague out in Portugal, as they were trying to unpick this new treasure trove of material that they found in the Portuguese archive that shows you kind of really how the Portuguese regiments fought and gives a really, really fresh, valuable insight into the nature of the Portuguese army and its fighting ability. At the time, Bob dropped a little bit of a teaser, which was that there is, a whole kind of section of the book, and there's a whole kind of treasure trove of information about the British officers in the force. I decided that we were going to make that a separate episode because it needed to be looked at in its own right. Quick disclaimer, this episode is recorded well in advance of when it goes out, but this will probably be out around about the time that I do my PhD Viva. So if this ends up being the last Napoleonicist episode, you will know that is because I have failed my Viva and I've decided to, send myself into exile on St. Helena, where I will live in a cave as a goat herd or something, and you shall never see with me again. So if this is the last Napoleonicist episode, it's been nice knowing you all, folks. But time will tell as to whether or not that ends up being the case. Back to the present. Bob, welcome back. Great to see you again. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's good to be back here, and I'll be the first to say I'm quite sure that you will pass your advisor, or whatever they call it, with flying colors. And we will soon be addressing you as Dr. Zach White.
Well, that's very generous of you. I wish I shared that kind of confidence, but we shall see. We shall see. Let's dive in. Where to begin? There's an obvious point with this, isn't there? Why? Why is it that these British officers are needed in the Portuguese army? And why, equally interestingly, is it felt by these officers that there's an advantage to going over to the Portuguese force? What's the just kind of layout for us, the thinking behind it all?
Okay, well, let's start with a little bit of history. In 1807, most of you will know that the French invaded Portugal and they disbanded the Portuguese army. They took the cream of the officers and soldiers and formed what was known as the Portuguese Legion and sent them off to Central Europe. And they eventually fought in Russia in 1812 and didn't survive the cold very well. And pretty much by 1813, those who were in the Legion no longer existed. But what happened then, there was no army in Portugal other than the French army. And in August of 1808, the British invaded in an attempt to liberate Portugal, which they did quite successfully, kicked the French out by December of 1808, and installed a new government. And the government realized they had to form a new army. Unfortunately, all the units had been disbanded, all the recruiting institutions and conscription methods were gone. And so they had to start from scratch. And they started doing a fairly good job, but by the beginning of 1809, they realized that they couldn't do it on their own. They needed to bring an outside force into the country to modernize the army, starting at the very top. And they selected or went to the British government and said, do you have an officer who's qualified to serve as our commander-in-chief of the Portuguese army? And the British government said, yeah, we'll do that. And they approached an individual, as most will know, William Carr Beresford, who actually had served in Portugal at the beginning of 1800, 1801, had worked with the Portuguese army and even spoke a bit of Portuguese. He immediately said, no, I don't want to do it. Find someone else. And the British government basically said, you either do it or retire. And he said, okay, I'll do it. In March of 1809, he went into, arrived in Lisbon, started setting up headquarters, and he realized he couldn't do it on his own. He had to bring in help because he wanted to train the Portuguese army in the British method of fighting a war. From the very top, from staff, command and control. He also wanted to teach them British drill and do such things instead of fighting in a 3-rank line, fighting in a 2-rank line, things along those lines. And he realized he needed help. So he went back to the government and said, can you second some British officers to the Portuguese? And his goal was wanted to, in addition to many staff officers, he wanted to have a British officer commanding either every regiment, infantry and cavalry regiment, or as a second in command, second senior officer in the regiment, if there was a Portuguese officer who was trained enough and qualified enough to command the regiment, then this second in command would be the British officer. If you do the numbers, he realized he would need about 200 officers to fill the ranks, to fill this. And that's just to fill the command positions, that's all. That didn't include the staff officers, and that would be another 40 or 50 staff officers. So you're talking, he needed approximately 250 officers. Of course, the question is, where did it get it? Where did he get them from? Was there problems find him? And I would have thought, I'm not sure I'd want to go and work with another army and basically get out of the army. But surprising, he didn't have any problems. The officers were lining up, volunteering to join, especially at the company and field grade officers. However, where he had the problems was finding suitable senior officers. And this was not a problem just for the Portuguese army. Wellington had the same problem, finding suitable officers to command his brigades, divisions, and eventually even the corps level, even though they weren't called corps. And it wasn't until about 1812 where Wellington was happy about the quality of the officers he was getting at the general officer level. Well, in 1809, Beresford's casting around looking for senior officers to command, and some were very good, a lot of them were not. So the call for volunteers went out, and the positions were open to all officer volunteers, but with 2 caveats. Army regulations prohibited more than 2 captains and 2 subalterns from a regiment from serving in a staff position outside of the regiment. Now, whether service with the Portuguese army was considered a staff position is not known, but this guidance was generally qualified. And what do I mean by staff position? You always hear about some bright young buck who has connections, and he's going to go be a aide de camp or go serve on in the adjutant general's department or the quartermaster general's department. And there were quite a few, especially among the guards regiments. But there were not as many as it appear to be. Because I said there was two caveats. Second one was that Army regulations prohibited an officer from serving on the staff unless he had a minimum of 4 years active service. This restriction was also generally qualified. And so if up to 4 officers requesting to do duty outside of the regiment, he could not stop them from doing that if the Army required it. However, if more than 4 wanted to, he could say, no, I'm not going to let you go until Jones or Smith return from this duty. And this makes a lot of sense because if you take the cream of the crop out of your regiment, you're going to start having problems.
So if they volunteer for the Portuguese service, does that mean that they have to resign their commission in the British service, or can they ride both horses, as it were? Because the whole thing for officers in this period is all about seniority and purchase of commissions, right? And they're kind of playing this game of transferring from one regiment to another to bump their way up the kind of the rankings of the promotion ladder, so that they can then buy the next step in their promotion. So you end up buying your captain number 1, if you like, the highest, the most senior captain's position in the rank, and then when the majority position, the major above you, dies or transfers to another unit, you can then get bumped up to major if you have the funds available. And it's a very complex game. So are they trying to do both things? Are they trying to sort of stay in the British system and gain their seniority in the British officer corps whilst also being in the Portuguese, or do they have to resign the commission in the British Army and go all in for the Portuguese service?
I'm going to give that a qualified yes. First, you need to understand the promotion system in the British Army. There was 2 types of ranks. Everyone started out with regimental rank, and regimental rank was yours unless you messed up badly and got court-martialed or cashiered. They could place you on half pay, but it was yours forever. They didn't necessarily have to allow you to advance, but they couldn't throw you out. Okay. Then you had Army rank. Army rank is also known as brevet rank. If you're serving in a position outside of your regiment that calls for, let's say your captain in position calls for a major, you will become a major in the Army system. And you can get promoted from major all the way up through general in the Army system, or Army rank system, and still have your regimental rank. However, you only are holding that rank as long as you're in the position that calls for it. For example, if you're in the Army, the Adjutant General's office, part of Wellington's headquarters, it may call for Lieutenant Colonel, and you're a major in your regiment and you get selected for that position, you're now a Lieutenant Colonel in the Army, but only a major in your regiment. And you do receive Lieutenant Colonel pay plus all the staff pay that goes with it. If you leave that job and you go back to your regiment, you revert back to major. So you would always, in most cases, they would call you by whatever your highest rank was in either system. So if you join the Portuguese Army, you still retain your regimental rank. However, there was one caveat. It's known as employed on a particular service. People sometimes think it was the P stood for Portuguese service. Initially in 1809, the Army said, okay, we will support Beresford and we will call these officers EOPS officers. And they selected 24 officers to serve in both the Portuguese and the Spanish Army. 21 would go to the Portuguese Army, 3 would go to the Spanish Army. they were immediately promoted. If you were a captain in the regimental rank, you were immediately promoted to major in the British Army rank. And then you were promoted to lieutenant colonel in the Portuguese rank. So an increase of 2 ranks promotion for the officer. The caveat, though, on it is if by agreeing for this increase in rank in the Army rank, they had to resign the regimental commission. Now, so these 21 officers gave up, some of them were majors who gave it up and became a lieutenant colonel in the Army, British Army. So most of them were captains and became majors. They gave up the regimental rank, and when they got back, came out of Portuguese service, unless they found a job within the Army structure on the staff someplace, they would go on half pay. They would be forced to retire and be unemployed. That happened about half the officers by the end of the war, that happened to. But most of them were able to find jobs or exchange their half pay Army rank for regimental active rank. So it depended on the system. Now, by joining the Portuguese Army, there was 2 advantages. The first is they immediately became 1 rank higher, and they got to draw both British and Portuguese pay. So they got a fairly high pay increase to do by doing so. So they had a lot of volunteers. People realized this is a good deal.
I'm not going to be funny. I'd volunteer. That sounds pretty good, getting 2 wages to me.
But the downside of it, though, is you are going into a totally, completely different army out of your comfort of your regiment. And you're not going to have the regimental support there that you would have if you stayed in the regiment. But they found the volunteers, and I'll give you a couple examples. We, in the 3rd and 11th Foot, had 10 officers each who served. Not simultaneously, though at one time, each had 6 officers serving with the Portuguese. And that's not counting those who were serving on the staff elsewhere. So that they must have either had a very lenient colonel, or they somehow slipped through the ranks. This 39th Foot had 6 servants simultaneous out of the 8 who had served in the Portuguese Army. And the 71st Foot had 7 volunteers. The most prominent being Dennis Pack, who I've mentioned in other episodes, and 6 of them were with the Portuguese at the same time. There were many volunteers, and the officers who were selected came from 84 different infantry regiments and 14 cavalry regiments, as well as 6 from the Royal Artillery. Interestingly, no officers came from the King's German Legion or were allowed to join. However, 4 were from its artillery component, the King's German Artillery. No engineer officers served, but 14 medical officers served in various positions over the years.
Do we know why there are no KGL officers who sign up?
No idea. I think they were having trouble finding enough officers to fill the ranks anyway.
That's true.
At a point that if you look at who served in the KGL, the longer they served, I think they were getting more and more English officers going in rather than being purely German officers. And probably one of the most famous memoirs that came out of the KGL units was by Dennis Wheatley, who was went in as an ensign, and it was definitely British. So
yes.
So the system worked. It a little convoluted, but they were able to find enough volunteers. They also asked for NCOs to volunteer, and they went out.
You've raised this, yes, because this is an important one, isn't it? Talk us through this, and also, does this work? Because what's very curious is that Wellington doesn't believe in this, does he? He kind of sees this cultural divide between the rank and file and the NCOs and the officer corps. And when he's asked about this idea of promoting NCOs up from the ranks, he kind of says, look, they can't do it because the officers mess is an environment where you're expected to spend money, where you're expected to be able to kind of conduct yourself to a particular social standard. And he doesn't believe that the NCOs can kind of manage. And so he says, well, look, most of them end up going off and descending into drunkenness, or they end up selling their commissions because they just can't hack it. So does this work in the Portuguese service?
Yes. We were able to identify 11 NCOs who went into Portuguese service. Out of 375, that's probably 3% total. What they did is Beresford said, okay, it's fine bringing in all these officers, but we also need someone who knows how to manage a regiment or a battalion, just drill, doing the paperwork. And so they brought in senior NCOs, usually sergeant majors, and they became adjutants for regiments, or several of them stayed back in the recruiting depots, and they ran the administrative side of the recruiting depots. That's in a study itself. Problem is identifying. There were probably more than 11, but the only ones I could actually identify by name, there was 11 of them. So interesting. As the war went on, the need for recruits or volunteers dropped because the Portuguese were getting better and better. And we saw a number of officers who were volunteers who they were not commissioned in the British Army initially. And while they were waiting for the commissions to go through, they joined the Portuguese Army. And then when they were in the Portuguese Army, their commission in the British Army came through. And they, I don't think they ever got above the rank of lieutenant in the Portuguese Army. And I'm not sure how much they could actually contribute to the Portuguese Army since they were basically new. They were not very experienced. But there were a handful of them we were able to identify. The way we could do that is we found the data rank of their commissioning in the Portuguese Army was several months earlier than the data rank of commissioning in the British Army. Otherwise, they would have said, oh, well, this guy did not do very well because he ended up leaving the Army as, or lieutenant of the Portuguese Army, never got any higher. Total number, though, was interesting. We think, I said they needed about 200 to 250. We were able to identify 376 who served. And by the end of the war, there was close to 200 still on working in the Portuguese Army. The largest number, not surprising, were 172 lieutenants who volunteered, 73 captains, 33 majors, 22 lieutenant colonels, 6 colonels, 1 brigadier general, and 1 lieutenant general. And of course, the lieutenant general was Beresford himself. Yeah. So, and most of them did quite well by the time they were done.
This is really interesting. There's so much that we've covered sort of there already that I'm going to kind of almost skip to the end, if you will, of this story and just ask about losses and kind of attrition, and also the way in which they replace those losses. So what is, in inverted commas, the butcher's bill? But also you were talking about, the need to obviously, find more officers and bring in more volunteers with time, because that's the nature of war. You lose your officers as you lose your men. But do the Portuguese start to rely more on sort of homegrown talent, as it were, and start promoting more men within their regiments as these units become veteran battalions and gain in confidence and experience?
Well, you have about 5 questions here. So let me start with the first one. Let's talk about the losses. They paid a heavy loss. We were, of the 376 officers that we could identify, 169 of them, or 45%, became casualties, which is a pretty high price to pay. 44 were killed in action or died of wounds, which was 12% of the total. And another 17 or 4% died of illness, disease, or exhaustion. So if you add it together, you had basically a 1 in 6 chance of dying, or a 50% chance of being wounded. Now, if you look at there was a major study done probably 100 years ago on looking at the casualties among British officers in the peninsula. And well, actually, overall, in the British Army at the time, they had serving in the peninsula, 40% chance of becoming a casualty, a 6% chance of being killed or dying from wounds, 29% chance of being wounded, and a 4% chance of dying from disease and illness. So that 4% dying from disease or illness didn't matter where you were, disease, Portuguese or British Army. The one I found, the major difference was dying from wounds, which was about a 6% for just serving in the British Army, but it was 12% if you were in the Portuguese Army. And I think there could be two things that contributed. One was the officers generally led from the front, but I think the British officers and Portuguese armies had to actually do that more often to motivate the men. Another thing, I think that probably the medical care was not as good. So if you got wounded, the chances of surviving a major wound was probably less than if you were under the British care. The other thing was you had a chance being wounded or captured. Most of those captured were wounded at the time. The other thing, and I don't have an exact number on this, but a lot of them returned home. Yeah, they survived the war, they survived the wounds, they survived the sickness, but they paid for it later on in life. And I think that they had a shorter life expectancy in the end, just because they didn't get the same quality of food at the time as they would have been in with the British Army. The healthcare was not as good, and so you paid. And I think if you look at for the officers who served even in the British Army, they get back and look at it compared to their civilian counterpart, and I think they probably had issues too. And that's still a modern day problem. The veterans come back face a lot of other issues that your typical civilian hadn't served never have to face. But that's for another study that could be very interesting. Now, I hate to say this, what was your other questions?
So the other one was about kind of promotion of, if you like, inverted commas, homegrown talent. So within Portuguese regiments, do you in time find more of a focus on promoting Portuguese NCOs, for example, or focusing on the recruitment and promotion of Portuguese officers rather than relying on British?
They did, but again, what they considered the best officers in the Portuguese Army were drafted into French service. And I used to probably conscripted, might be another, someone voluntarily. A lot of them were told they had to go. And when they got there, some never made it to France. They deserted the first opportunity. So what was considered the cream of the crop was cut off the top. And then you had the system itself. When they stood up the army, a lot of people came back to the flags, but you had senior officers who were geriatric, to be nice. And there was also a homegrown movement, especially up in Oporto, where units were raised before, they kicked the French out. And what do you do with those officers? And so they had to integrate them. Initially, about 80% of the commands went to the British, just because they couldn't. The Portuguese, it was a very static system where promotions were slow, and you could be 20 years as a lieutenant before you got promoted to captain, and your regimental commanders could be 50 or 60 years old. Not the type you want to have command in the field. So by 1811, about 80% of the commands were given to British officers. as I said, Beresford had trouble finding qualified people to serve at the higher ranks, especially at brigade level. As I mentioned, the Portuguese officers are too old, but this was a problem that Wellington had too for his own brigades. And so you saw in 1809, 1810, 1811, about half the brigade commanders were replaced by 1812. In 1812, 70% of the brigade were commanded by British officers. However, this was decreased before. So there were some Portuguese officers who were recognized as being competent, and they were brought into command. However, in 1813, 16 of the regimental, I jumped ahead. 1813, the number of brigade commanders commanded by British was at 80%. 1814, it dropped to 70%. So you can see that the more and more commands were given to Portuguese officers. You had the Portuguese division, which was commanded off and on, sometimes by Portuguese officers, sometimes by a British officer. At the regimental level, in 1810, 11 of the 24 regiments were commanded by the British commander. However, 1811, it was up to 12, so that's 50%. 1812, 13 had British commanders, and by 1813, this number increased to 16. So you're talking 2/3 of the infantry regiments were commanded by British. However, by 1814, it was down to 12. So 50% were commanded by British. Between 1809 and 1814, 38 British officers had commanded an infantry regiment. So they were being run through the system. Some were promoted to brigade command. Some were removed from service because they didn't cut the mustard, and some were became casualties or left for another reason. It was the same for the Cacadois battalions. However, 1812, 11 of the 12 Cacadois commanders were British, and by 1814, it was down to 6. So it's slowly but surely the Portuguese were filling the staff positions. But they had to be trained, they had to be identified and trained, and it took a while. And the same for the British. Some of them succeeded, some of them did not.
Yeah, there's a certain logic to all of that, isn't there? What I also just really admire is that I fire these questions at you just as they pop into my head, and you're just like, yeah, I can handle that. You know, I happen to have the access to those figures. This is the capacity of some of the researchers of this period, and some of the guests that we have on this podcast that just blows my mind when we have people like yourself who can just take any question that I fire at them and go, yeah, I have loads of detailed information that I can just pluck out of the air on that. It's incredible. Let's talk
I'd like to bring up something that we kind of skipped over. And for me, what was considered the primary reason why a British officer wanted to join. Many years ago, I joined the Army right out of high school for fun, travel, and adventure. I had the scholarship to the university. I said, I don't want to go to the university yet. And I joined the Army, and for that was one of the reasons. But another reason directly related was opportunity. These officers saw a chance that they could do things that would never have the chance to do it before. And I'll give you 2 examples that why they did it. The first was John McDonald, who we're going to talk about before. He was a lieutenant and was in the 88th Fourth and was selected to become a volunteer officer. He was immediately commissioned a captain in the Portuguese Army and in the 2nd Infantry Division in March 1809. So he was one of the first officers who was not, well, I mentioned the EOPS officers. He was one of the first who was not an EOPS officer who joined the Portuguese Army. He was promoted to major in November of 1809. So if he had been in his regiment, he would still be a lieutenant. And now he's a major, commanded a battalion in the Portuguese Army. And before, he wouldn't even been considered to command a company. He led this battalion at Busaco, Medina, Campo Mayor, first siege of Badajoz, Albuera. And then on the 14th, in March of 1812, he was transferred to the 14th Infantry. In April, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel in it and given command of the regiment. This is in 1812. 3 years ago, or 2.5 years before, he was a lieutenant. He led it in the campaign all throughout the 1812 campaign. In 1813, we're finally at Banca in the Pyrenees. He was severely wounded and basically was hospitalized. However, in 1814, he was given temporary command of the Portuguese brigade. Okay, and said, okay, that's pretty good. And he commanded Toulouse. He was only 26 years old at the time. He was a brigade commander. Yeah.
No way. Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm feeling horrifically old now at the not so ripe old age of 29. I did not quite see my
God,
30th.
you are old. But however, if he had not joined the Portuguese army, he would have been a captain, still a captain in 88 Foot. And he would be junior to 8 other captains. So the chances of them even making mayor were slim to none. And commanded a regiment, no less a brigade. No way. However, that's not the most famous of the individuals. You may have heard of Captain Alexander Dixon of the Royal Artillery. He was commissioned a major in the Portuguese Army in 1809 and immediately given command of the equivalent of 3 Portuguese artillery batteries, or what they were called brigades. He led them throughout the war at sieges, including at Ciudad Rodrigo. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the Portuguese Army on 24 March 1812. He led the Portuguese artillery at Almarez, Salamanca Forts, Salamanca, and Burgos. And during the campaigns of 1813 and 1814, even though he was only a captain in the British Army, he was lieutenant colonel in the Portuguese Army. He was chief of Wellington's artillery. He had over 200 guns under his command or control. He resigned his commission in October 1814. And upon returning to commission in the Portuguese Army, and upon returning to England, none of this mattered. The fact that he commanded 200 guns at Victoria, no, they didn't care. He reverted back to his Royal Artillery rank of captain, which was not senior enough to command that company or brigade, artillery brigade. And he didn't make major in the British Army until 1823. He did end up being retired as a major general. He stayed in long enough. But so here's a chance. I mean, and he took it. He was the senior artillery officer in Wellington's army by the time the war was over. And yet, if he had stayed in, he might have commanded artillery brigade as a brevet major or even just as a captain. So opportunity. And I don't think you can emphasize that enough when you're looking at chances. That because you brought it up at the very beginning. Everyone's trying to gain promotion at whatever means they can. And well, it worked for him. And John McDonnell, when he went back, he was still a captain. But he at one point he was led his brigade in battle, which not too many lieutenants could say that.
The Dixon manuscripts are fascinating. If anybody is ever able to turn up a copy, they were published by Ken Trotman many years ago. And it's fascinating to read them on 2 levels, because what you've got are sort of his, a number of, not all of, but a number of his private letters alongside his official ones. And just kind of watching his career. This is a guy with an incredible attention to detail. You can see why he ends up as commander of Wellington's artillery, because he's got this almost kind of Wellingtonian attention to detail. But at the same time, as he kind of makes his way up the ranks, he gets private letters from people saying, you've changed. They're doing the equivalent of going, you've changed, man. You used to be cool. And he's basically become more and more formal with them. And they're sort of going, well, why are you being so formal with me? Because he's kind of embracing this almost meteoric rise that he enjoys. Yeah, two fascinating examples.
His letters or the manuscripts are amazing. He was a pack rat. He never threw anything out, including letters that he wrote, letters he received. There's diaries in it from other officers, and also his own personal journal. And he would say, "Oh, we were in this village; it can hold 300 people." Or we went to this village, and now it can only hold 50 people. The fodder's not good enough to for our draft animals. So that attention to detail, as you pointed out, incredible, and it's rare to find that in any set of memoirs. But they are there. I can see why he got promoted. So anyway, that is, I think, the primary reason why people joined. It was an opportunity to get promoted, and it paid off.
What happens at the end then? What happens to 1814? Do some stay? Well, presumably some must stay, but what's the reason for them choosing to do that? Give us numbers, give us reasons, do the thing that you do so well, enlighten us.
Well, good question. The war ends, and you think, well, it's need for them to go home, but they didn't. Let me find my notes again. They were allowed to stay in the army. Many resigned their commissions and rejoined the regiments. However, when the war ended, the British officers continued to be promoted, especially at the general officer and field grade level. So why do I want to go back and be major or captain when I could be a big fish in a small pond? I could be a colonel or even a brigadier general in the Portuguese army. In 1815, there were 2 British major generals and 7 brigadier generals, or 20% of all generals in the Portuguese service were British.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Of the 76 British officers who chose to stay at the end of the war, and were at the regimental and battalion level, 4 were colonels commanding infantry regiments, and 1 commanded a cavalry regiment. 8 of the 12 Cacadori battalions were commanded by British lieutenant colonels. However, by December 1816, the British Army said, "Wait a minute, we've had enough. We're not going to let you milk the system like you've been doing it." And they gave them a choice. First one was resign from the Portuguese Army and come back to your regiment, or you can continue in the Portuguese Army, but they had to trade the regimental commissions for army rank. So if they left the Portuguese Army 2 years later, they'd be on half pay unless they could find a job. So many of them chose to stay. By 1818, the number of British generals had increased to 1 lieutenant general, 7 major generals, and 6 brigadier generals, or 21% of all the generals in the Portuguese Army. And there's still 58 officers at the unit level, and most have been promoted. This caused problems, not for the British Army or for the training, but initially when the British armies came in, they were welcomed wholesale by the Portuguese officers. Hey, we need to get up to snuff. We need to become more modernized. And they were welcomed, and they accepted the fact that all these British officers were the best qualified ones to command the brigades and regiments. However, by 1818, the war had been over for 4 years, and their attitude changed. They perceived there was a preference for British commanders over Portuguese commanders, and there was much resentment by the Portuguese officer corps. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Portuguese history post the Peninsular War, but in 1820 there was a liberal revolt, 26th August 1820, which overthrew the current government. The Portuguese officers supported that wholesale. I mean, and the main reason is they resented the British officers being in all the high positions. New government comes in, and first thing they did was they fired all the British officers. However, a year later or 6 months later, the government said, okay, that's not really fair to all these British who served faithfully. And they said they can continue to serve, receive pay for being in the Portuguese army equal to the number of years you already did. So if you had been an officer for 7 years, then you'd get 7 more years of pay. But after that, you'd be fired. Some of them, they were also offered a pension, which would be a third of their pay. And that included Beresford. And then there were several others. There was a civil war, a couple of civil wars in the 1820s, and some of the British officers got involved in fighting back and forth, supporting the various factions. But the primary cause or one of the major causes of the revolt was the fact that in 1820 was Portuguese officers were tired of the British dominance in Portuguese affairs. So it was kind of a sad ending for it, but it didn't surprise me in the least bit when I read about it. So
no, I would completely echo that no, it's not surprising, but it is a sad end. Let's stay with problems then for a moment. The first thing that springs to mind is language barrier, right? With the best will in the world, most of these officers won't have been able to converse with members of their rank and file's native language. So how big an issue does that end up being?
Initially, a very major issue. And there's correspondence from Brigadier General William Cox, who commanded Almeida when it fell to the French in 1810. But he's writing back to Beresford and says, these guys who came to command and train the troops are good, but they don't speak Portuguese. Part of the problem was solved by, they commissioned quite a few local officers who were of British descent, especially from Porto, where port wine came from. And some of them were quite famous. A guy named Ware, his family was big in the import-export of port from Porto, and he ended up translating all the British drill manuals into Portuguese. And he did it fairly quickly. So, by the beginning of 1810, they were published and out there. And before a unit could be certified combat ready, they were inspected, and they had to be able to perform all the different maneuvers as shown by the manuals. And this was also where the NCOs who commissioned from the ranks and brought over, they were quite often doing the training on that. So language up and down, they were not given the orders in English. They had to give them Portuguese. They were integrated into the Portuguese army. And I don't think very many of them were fluent enough to write orders or anything else, but they could converse in Portuguese. And I think back then, people tended to learn languages a little easier than they do today, especially for among the English speakers, because English is kind of the common language throughout the world. But back then, French was. And so the cases, I have diaries of people who could speak. They're writing, oh, I got to learn Portuguese, and taking Portuguese lessons or Spanish lessons. So they got better. Writing, probably not. And I think when we talked about the after action reports in a previous episode, it was pretty determined that the after action reports were dictated to a Portuguese officer to put it into proper Portuguese style before it went forward. That was probably initially the biggest problem. But something to keep in mind was Portuguese officers or the British officers in the Portuguese army were subjected to Portuguese discipline, which we can talk about in a couple of minutes. So let's talk about it now. I've lost my train of thought.
I mean, you turned to a mention of discipline, and I'm there. So
okay, so let's talk about the discipline issues. There are cases where officers came over and with an attitude, saying, "Hey, I'm British, I know everything, and yeah, even though you higher rank than me, I don't have to listen to your orders because I was brought in to be in your army." Most were encouraged to leave. One was basically fired, told to leave. So that happened occasionally, not too often. And then there was criminal complaints. There were a few. We know for sure of one. I mentioned John McDonnell, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Portuguese army, who the 26-year-old commanded the brigade. The day after Toulouse, he was court-martialed for murder. By the Portuguese system, not the British system, by the Portuguese system.
we have talked about this before, actually. I can't remember if we did it on air or not.
No, we did not.
Bearing in mind that this is a radio show, my eyebrows just shot up into my rapidly receding hairline because this is a rarity for an officer to be tried for murder. So we need to hear the juicy gossip here.
Okay, well, and even rarer, he was tried by a Portuguese court. He was not tried,
or military court?
Military court. He was given a fair trial, supposedly, and found guilty, and was ordered to be strangled, executed by strangulation. This was not good publicity for either side, and I'm not sure who intervened, but actually it went up, it was appealed at the highest level and equivalent to their Supreme Court or something, said, no, we can't do this. And they dismissed him from the Portuguese army. Okay. And he had to return back to the 88th foot. So he's a captain, he goes back to being a captain of the 88th foot after successfully leading his brigade at Toulouse and wounded and everything else. What the actual charges were, other than murder and the why and who he killed or anything else, we have no idea. I talked to Rory Muir out of Australia, who's kind of my go-to guy on a lot of things. And he goes, he had never heard of a case before of that, but he said that he didn't think it would have mattered. It depended on, you know, did he kill his mistress? Did he kill someone else? And if he had, then probably the British Army, his fellow officers said, well, he got what was coming to him then, if he was executed. But we don't really know the details. However, what we do know is after he was dismissed from the Portuguese army, he rejoined his regiment, and it was like it never happened. There was no impact on his career in the British Army, and he retired as a full general about, and I think it was 1846 or something. So hopefully someday someone's going to discover the records in the Portuguese archives.
I wish I could say that any of what you said had surprised me, but this is It's funny you talk about mistresses. It does just have that slight air of one of those cases that the British particularly might be more inclined to just ignore because of how they deal with crimes against civilian women, and just the way in which these things aren't treated with the same level of seriousness. What staggers me is that this case even went to court, because in the British system, it just doesn't happen. You don't see, and I'd need to just double check my court martial database to be sure here. Apologies, folks, for the crime and punishment rabbit hole, but this is interesting. You just don't see officers tried for murder. You certainly don't ever see an officer being sentenced to death. It's just not done. So it's really interesting to see that there's this sort of effort to take it seriously, and then people step back from the brink. It's all quite peculiar.
Yeah, it would have been very interesting if they actually executed, and to see how they would have, the British officers would have reacted to it. And of course, we don't know the details of the case. It might have been he was in a duel, but I can't imagine who would be dueling. And because it was the day after Toulouse, the battle was over, and he was arrested, and within a week he was tried and convicted in order to be executed. So fortunately for him, it was not. But hopefully someday someone will find it.
But if it had been dueling, they'd have probably called it dueling, or they'd have tried him on 2 charges. So they might have put him up for murder and for a duel in order to hedge their bets. Because by this point, you've got people like Francis Larpent out there. Now, Larpent's an experienced Deputy Judge Advocate General. He's hired for this purpose because he's a civilian lawyer. So he knows the system. So by the time he's out there in 1812, 1813, making his presence felt, you see Wellington's army effectively getting their act together and dealing with these issues. So it's all and the army has the British army at least, has no issue with charging people for dueling. It just finds it impossible to secure a conviction because all of the officers go, I never saw any dueling. I was just going for a lovely walk. I've got no idea how this guy ended up with a bullet in his left arm. Definitely wasn't any case of dueling that I saw, but I didn't see anything, kind of thing. And you get these farcical episodes where cases collapse for lack of evidence because quite literally nobody apparently saw anything. And it drives some of the commanders absolutely potty.
Well, the question is, if it wasn't a crime in the Portuguese army, would Wellington have tried to try him or court-martial him in the British army, since he wasn't serving in the British army at the time, though he was an active member of the British army. So I have no idea. I will have to take a look at Larpin's letters and see if they mention it at all. I've never thought of looking in there. Should be easy to find out. If it's April of 1814, should have some information in there if it reached that level. So
the other one would be the Orders dos Diem, because if it was a military court, it would have to be a general court-martial or a Portuguese equivalent, which then in all likelihood would have been reported in the general orders that went out, because that's just what the British did. And the Portuguese system is a mirror of the British system at this time. So that might be the other place where you get a clue. And in there you'll get the full charges listed.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. I do have a copy of those. It was Moises, my co-author, was the one who pointed out the information on it. And he may have found them in the orders of the day. I just found it a very fascinating case. Okay, those are your 2 extremes. One who doesn't want to take orders from a Portuguese officer, another one who's convicted of murder. But there was other problems in there, discipline problems within by the British officers serving. And this comes down to question of rank. Who is senior to who? Now, I mentioned earlier at the very beginning that you had regimental rank, you had army rank. Now we throw in a third element. You have Portuguese army rank. So I'm an officer. Let's say I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Portuguese army. I was captain in my regiment, and I'm a brevet major in the British Army. Okay. So I've got three different ranks. What happens if I'm serving with a major who's commanding, or I'm in a task force that has my regiment, Portuguese regiment, but also my British regiment. And it was commanded by a lieutenant colonel who I am senior to in the Portuguese army, but by regimental rank, I'm not even, he's a lieutenant colonel in my regiment. I'm only a captain who has command. This happened, not fairly often, but enough that Wellington had to get involved. And
can I make a prediction here? Does Wellington go British Army rules okay, and therefore whoever's most senior in the British system ends up in charge? Is that how it tends to work out?
No.
Wow.
Wellington was actually very adamant about it. He said whoever's senior in rank is senior in rank regardless of what army. And there was a case, two cases I'll bring up. One was a guards officer who was serving on the staff, and he had his army rank and was in a position where he had to give orders to his former battalion commander in the guards, who outranked him quite a bit. But he was more senior to the guards officer. And Wellington said, no, whoever senior rank, regardless of where he got the rank from, is senior. And the guards officer said, I'm appealing it, and went up to Whitehall, and Whitehall backed Wellington on it. So he was pretty adamant about that. There is a case where at the general officer level where it happened more often. George Madden, who successfully got his battalion commander or regimental commander court-martialed in 1801, and then was forced out of the army for betraying his regimental commander. Even though the regimental commander was found guilty and he testified against him, they said, well, so we suggest you resign your commission. He was brought back in 1808, was allowed restored in rank, and said, we'd suggest you go and join the Portuguese army in 1809, 1810. So he was a brigadier general in 1813, commanded a Portuguese brigade in I don't remember what division, but he was senior to Dennis Pack. Dennis Pack, this was in 1813. They both got promoted to Portuguese, to brigadier general. Pack got promoted in the British Army and resigned his commission in the Portuguese Army and took over a British brigade in the same division that Madden was commanding the Portuguese brigade. So now we have a British officer who's extremely competent, commanding a British brigade, who's like a week junior to the British officer commanding a Portuguese brigade, who's not that Wellington didn't have a lot of faith in. Division commander is absent. And they needed to appoint an acting division commander. And Madden said, I'm senior. It needs to be me. Wellington said, you're right. But what he didn't say is, yeah, I'm not sticking you in command of the division. You're barely competent as a brigade commander. And he basically relieved Madden as command of the Portuguese brigade and sent it back to Lisbon. So he could give Pack command of the division, because he didn't want to take a chance of Madden commanding the brigade or commanding the division. Madden got screwed over technically. There's a question. He was no Pack. He was probably as good as about most of the brigade commanders at the time, but there was nothing he could do. He either put him in division commander or got rid of him. And he said, no, I'm not taking a chance. We're getting rid of him. So throughout the war, Wellington had to manage and stroke the egos of all these different senior commanders saying, okay, you the senior commander of this brigade, but and you're senior brigade commander in this division. However, you got, for example, the light division. It was commanded by a brigadier general. Yeah, you're senior to him, but I'm not giving you command of the division because you're not that good of a commander. But he didn't say that to him. And so he's always trying to manage his people to get the right person at the right time within the structure of the two armies. And it was difficult enough to do it with the British Army and the dual rank system of regimental and army rank. But then you throw in the British officers serving in the Portuguese Army in their rank, and they got promoted quite fast compared to the other army. And it did cause problems, but it was resolved. Wellington found a way to manage it. And Madden was the most obvious one.
What I find so curious about this, though, from Wellington's perspective, is Wellington is not the most senior by any means commander in the British Army during this period. And folks who aren't familiar with the period won't realize that there's this kind of issue that the British Army has, and the commanders in Whitehall have, that they can't send certain people out to Spain and Portugal to serve with the British Army because they're senior to Wellington. They would normally supersede him. Now, if he's going to kind of adopt this system of whatever your rank is, you are senior, there's a big contradiction here in the form of Beresford, who is a marshal of the Portuguese army. So marshal outranking what's Wellington by this point, a lieutenant general?
He was. I think
is
he
a big
became a
contradiction.
field marshal in 1813.
Exactly. And Beresford, I forget where, and this is shameful, but
it was March or April of 1809. Good question. I never looked at it, but I think it was part of the British said, well, then you're in charge. Beresford, you could be, an 8-star general as far as we care, but you're still going to be subordinate to, if Beresford, if he didn't really want to be there and initially didn't want to go, he could have said he could resign, but he didn't. He was still in the army until 1820. And it was, for him, it was a pretty sweet deal. I mean, he had 40, 50,000 men under his direct command, and it was in command of all the operations in southern part of Portugal for a while. And so I don't think he wanted to rock the boat, but that's another area I have no idea on why there weren't more issues about it. I never really even thought about it at that point.
This was why I was so convinced when you said that, this was going to be Wellington's way, that British Army, British government are paying for this, therefore that's going to be the point of seniority. How very curious. It's a perplexing point on which we are sadly at an end. Bob, I have loved this second part as much as I've loved the first part. Your book, In the Words of Wellington's Fighting Cocks, is out now. Folks, you know the rant by now. Not Amazon, please. Please go direct to the Pen and Sword website in order to support the lovely authors who come on here. I am unfortunately unable to pay them for their appearances because this podcast barely makes enough money as it is. So they don't get an interviewee's fee, much though I would love to pay them. So support them in a different way. Please go direct to the Pen and Sword website in order to buy this. Don't go to Amazon. And enjoy what is a fascinating read. Bob, it has been a joy as ever. Do come back again sometime soon. And thank you so much for your time tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be on. Hopefully this is not the last episode, and there'll be many more in the future. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch.
And there will be an announcement on whether or not this is the last Napoleonist episode in just a few seconds' time. Before you go, folks, all the usual things. Remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and you can find me on Twitter at ZWhiteHistory. A huge thank you as ever to my Patreon supporters. It is their support that keeps this podcast going. If you're interested in contributing to the show, you can find out more from the link in the description. Prices start from £1 a month, and you get all kinds of perks, from discount codes on
pen and sword books, which means you actually quite rapidly end up regaining some of the money that you invest in the show, all the way through to voting rights, shout-outs in episodes, and even one-to-one meetings with me. If a regular subscription isn't your thing, which believe me I completely understand, you can leave one-off tips via Ko-fi. Again, the link is in the description, and all the money gets reinvested into producing more content further down the line. And I have a big project in mind involving footage from battlefields that could potentially be a really engaging, exciting project if I can bring the money together to make it happen. A big thank you as ever to my Emperor level patrons Mark Stoos, JC Kaiser and Todd and Led Campbell, my Marshal patrons Matt Bone and Marcus Cribb, my Commander patrons John Haynes, Ger Brown, Liam Telfer, Jane Davis, Bob Burnham, Andy Meakin and Michael Guest, my Mentioned in Dispatches Plus patron Noah Fink, and my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons Miles Reedy, Alexandra Leon, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, Bruins Girl, Gareth Copeland, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brennan, Indiana Fats, James Bevan, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lynn Dawson, Mark Dewhurst, Mark Anscombe, Rob Griffith, Roy Muir, Ross Flowers, Ryan Diamond, Rob Cothlan, Mark Trowbridge and Stephen Coulson. Hello folks, so for that announcement that you've been very patiently waiting for, well, if you follow me on Twitter then you'll know that actually it's not that big announcement anymore, it is old news. I am very humbled and privileged to say that I did in fact pass my PhD Viva on Wednesday of this week, and so technically I am now Dr. White, which believe me is taking a huge amount of getting used to. I just want to take a moment to thank so many people who've made that process happen, not least my supervisors, Dr. Julie Gammon, Professor Chris Walgar and Professor David Brown at Southampton University. I'm particularly indebted to the Special Collections Department and Dr. Karen Robson, who runs that department, because they were the people who invested in me and literally funded me through the first 3 years of that PhD process. And if it hadn't been for that funding, then I would never have embarked on the PhD to be sitting here now. I also want to say a really big thanks to 3 very dear friends of mine who collectively convinced me that I had what it took to do the PhD. Charles Esdale, Ed Koss and Rory Muir. It's quite a disconcerting experience when you've got 3 giants of the Napoleonic period and Napoleonic scholarship kind of rooting for you and telling you that you have got the tools in your arsenal to go ahead and actually make a convincing PhD project. And if it hadn't been for them, I would never have dared to dream. So a massive, massive thank you to them. I also want to say a big thank you to everybody on Napoleonic Twitter. There are too many people out there to name. But if you're listening and you're one of those, you know exactly who you are. And also I want to say a big thank you to you guys, the people who listen to this podcast. Sure, the podcast isn't an integral part of the PhD and what I've done, but it has still been an important part of my life and something that's kept me going through some pretty challenging periods of doubt in recent times. The horizon still looks kind of fuzzy. I don't know what the future holds. There's certainly no job security now I've got the PhD, but it has been a joy to podcast for you guys, and I'm sure it kind of goes without saying that having passed, the Napoleonicist will continue. I will be back very soon, but until then, I am Dr. Don't you know, Zach White. This has been the Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.